Good afternoon, sorry. Well, it is afternoon back home in Oakland, not here. Good evening, everyone. So we're just going to go ahead and get into it and get started. So a little overview of how we're going to talk about some of these things today. Do a little introduction. We'll do a little definition of what structural racism is. Talk about housing, because housing is a really effective site to talk about how structural racism has impacted communities like mine and many others across the country over years. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the impacts of those policies in our community, and then a little bit of where we go from here. Then I want to be quiet and let you all ask questions and maybe have a little conversation. So first, this is my family. That's my wife, Celeste, 16 years. My younger son, Parker. My older son, TJ. Parker's 9. TJ just turned 12 last week. He's very excited. And I share them with you for a couple of reasons. One, were they here, they'd be outside playing in the snow, because again, it doesn't snow in Oakland. And so you wouldn't see them, because they'd be outside snowball fighting, and my wife would be trying to corral them a little bit. But two, and more importantly, because I'm really obsessed with figuring out how to make the world better for them. And they inspire me. They challenge me, Lord knows, they challenge me, but they inspire me to figure out how do we try to leave this world better than the way that we found it when we came into it. And so I share them with you so that way, hopefully they may inspire you as well, that we're not going to get to the world that they deserve without all of us putting in our collective work. So just a brief invitation to share my family. All right, let's talk about what's structural racism. So structural racism is a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various and often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial inequality, right? An example of other norms, because that might be a little confusing, until very recently in California, you could actually discriminate against someone by the way they wore their hair, right? And that's actually still true in much of the country. And in fact, there was just a case, I think maybe last year, where a teacher or a school administrator in Texas colored in a young black boy had sort of carved, beautiful design in his hair. There's a barber, very common thing in our community. And the teacher had colored it in, said this is a distraction. So took a Sharpie and sort of ran over the boy's head. Now, I'm going to tell you, if you do that to my kid, we're really going to have some issues. But that's a norm, right? That again goes a long way perpetuating images of beauty, all of that. Structural racism is not a bug, but a feature of the social, economic, and political systems in which we all live. So this type of system, sort of inherent structurally racist system, has been a part of this country for a very long time. And so there's a way in which we can buy into a narrative of America that, that was a mistake, but we're getting better. And in fact, we may be getting better in some areas, but we have an awful long way to go. All right, a couple of quotes that I love that help me think about this. One is by W. Edwards Deming. Every system is exquisitely designed to get the results it produces. What I love about this quote is it always reminds me that whatever thing we're dealing with, if it feels like it's a small thing, if we step back and figure out how did we get here, oftentimes there are other things connected to it, and if we want to change that condition, we actually have to figure out how we're trying to deal with multiple things simultaneously. Second, George Orwell. To see what is in front of one's nose need a constant struggle. We as humans can be predisposed to ignoring the thing that we see in front of us, because sometimes confronting that reality is hard, it's scary, we don't know what to do, we think we're going to screw it up and fail, we might actually screw it up and fail. And so our inclination can be, I'm just not going to look at that. And the reality is that doesn't actually get the problem fixed, right? If you have I understand heat leakage from houses is a big thing here. And so if you have a little leak from your house, you're like, I'm going to just ignore that. And I imagine over time, if you don't fix it, it probably gets more costly and more costly and more costly. And then eventually, there's a much larger bill that comes due. Versus, let me figure out what we got to do to get that fixed. All right, let's talk about Oakland. Oakland, California. It probably looked like this today, balmy 60 degrees. And Oakland is a city of, depending upon how you count it, 490, 500,000 people located in the San Francisco Bay Area, sort of metro region of several million people. Obviously, that monstrosity across the way is San Francisco, but we blurred it out because we're talking about Oakland today. But obviously it's 9 counties, many of them, many of the largest tech companies, many of the largest foundations. It's a gigantic place that sort of has an outsized pull. It is also the name of the San Francisco 49ers, which you were all kind enough to gift us a new quarterback a couple years ago. I want to appreciate you all for that once again. Thank you. Much love. But Oakland's also fairly segregated. It's been segregated for a very long time. Oakland, up until roughly the 1940s, was a predominantly white city. It was founded, I think it was 1851. And it was predominantly white city. And then as the Great Migration began, as there were massive shipbuilding yards sort of in the surrounding areas of Oakland, Richmond, Vallejo, large military installations, a large army base, Treasure Island Naval Station, Concord Naval Weapons Station. That industry was actually a very important draw for large numbers of African Americans who were looking to escape Jim Crow segregation in the South, other forms of segregation in the North, and my grandmother was one of them. And so that's why I can report being from Oakland and San Francisco and not from Natchitoches, Louisiana. So we're going to talk about housing and why housing. Ta-Nehisi Coates, a couple of summers ago, wrote a terrific piece on the impact of housing over time. And so there was this marvelous quote in which he said, housing determines transportation, access to transportation, green spaces, decent schools, decent food, decent jobs, and decent services. Housing affects your chances of being robbed and shot as well as being stopped and frisked. So housing matters immensely. So to step back for a second and talk a little bit about housing history in America, mortgage crisis of the 1930s. So stock market crashed, Black Tuesday, 1929, and one of the immediate impacts of that was people didn't have money to pay bills, and one of the most important bills of the time was your mortgage. At that point in time, oftentimes the mortgage system back then was much different than it is today for the most part. And one of the things that you had to put up to 50% of the funding down up front. You often had loans where you had 5 to 7 years to pay it all off. Or you just basically kept extending it, and oftentimes you weren't able to accumulate equity in the house. But that was the way the system was, and nobody thought anything about it, and people were always able to pay, and so it was fine until they couldn't pay. And you began to see quite precipitously both a severe decline in home prices, in some cases as high as 25% in some areas, but you also saw mass foreclosures. At one point, it was 1,000 homes were being foreclosed on a day. And from the perspective of the federal government, this was not going to work, right? They were already cash strapped. Folks were panicking. Banks were closing. Savings and loans were closing. Thrifts were closing. It was a problem. And so the federal government, in its infinite wisdom, said, we're going to do 2 things. One, we're going to create the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation would say, if your home is about to be foreclosed on, we're going to just buy the mortgage from the bank. It was a way both to inject capital back into banks, good, but also take that loan, restructure to redesign it, and then let folks pay that off over 15 years, and eventually became 25 years, which is why that's kind of the default mortgage setting for us now. But also, they restructured so that way you can get equity in the house, right? So then if, let's say you sold it in 10 years, you got a chance to move to lovely Standish, Maine, and you want to sell your house in Boston, you could sell your house in Boston, take that equity and use it to buy another house in Standish, Maine. Terrific. The second thing they did was they created what's called the Federal Home Administration. This still exists today. And the FHA, what the FHA did is they did many things. One of the more important things is they guaranteed mortgages for banks, right? So they said, if this goes under, you're not losing all your money bank. That's a good deal. They also, as all that war housing needed to be built, both during World War II for workers, so my grandmother lived in Potrero Hill, and Potrero Hill was actually a constellation of public housing that was constructed on the hillside, a beautiful hillside actually in San Francisco. But the purpose of that housing was basically to provide housing for all the people they needed to go work at Hunters Point Naval Shipyard, which was kind of just down the road a bit, right? So they underwrote that because when the builder who built that complex wanted to start building, there was nothing there but dirt. And so you couldn't appraise it. They didn't have the capital up front. So basically the federal government said, here's a bunch of money and you're going to build this. Now, a couple of catches with this. One, in order both for either the Homeowners Loan Corporation or the FHA to sort of believe that this is a good investment, they have to get some information about the area and the house, right? So these maps are the maps they used, right? Simple, that seems like a reasonable process, except both the FHA and the Homeowners Loan Corporation use local realtors to draw these maps. Well, the code of ethics for local realtors at the time said, we're not going to bring integration into places where it doesn't exist, right? Their stance was, if we have a primarily white neighborhood and we say, hey, let's actually move a bunch of black families in there, it will destabilize that neighborhood. So they said, we're going to do essentially everything we can to prevent integration in housing. Now, again, this was a policy they passed as a private agency, as a private entity, some time ago. But the impact of that, when given the fuel of the federal government, actually has become quite devastating. So this is a map for Oakland. I'm going to show you this in a slightly different version. Oh, thank you. So good to me, Chris. Thank you. So let's see. All right, get out of this, go over to this. Oh, there it is, beautiful. So this is actually a live map for Oakland. Someone, I think it might be University of Richmond, they took these maps and they laid them over the GIS maps for the community. So you can do this for every state, every city in the country that has one of these maps, which is both really interesting and slightly horrifying. And let me show you why. So let me zoom in a bit here. If I can do this without breaking the whole thing again. All right, so this is Oakland. And this is where I live, right here. Literally, I kid you not, right there on that line is actually my house today. So I'm going to click it. I'm going to see, oh, don't do that. Oh, I can do this way. I'm going to show the area description. So you can't read this. I'm going to read it for you. So, spotted area. Occasionally there are several blocks which are practically free of coloreds or Orientals. But on the other hand, certain blocks of the area are nearly 100% Negro, consistently spreading population increasing due to crowding of lower income families, zoned for light industrial, no restrictions, this type of residence. So literally every single one of these maps is filled with this type of clinical antiseptic language about my community. And in fact, they often talked about infiltration of was actually the language they used. Infiltration of Negroes or Orientals or Latin races was quite common. At the time when they were doing these maps, both the federal government and the real estate industry had a pretty strong bias against apartments. They really pushed very aggressively single-family homes. And so on these maps, areas that were designated as red were considered hazard, which meant you actually couldn't get FHA loans, right? Which means if there were African Americans living in the neighborhood, you weren't getting an FHA loan if you wanted to buy that house. You had to pay much more money. Let's see. So let's go up. So this one, see if I can get there without breaking it again. This little spot here is a place called Burkhalter Park, which was actually a long-standing elementary school in Oakland, a beautiful sort of large park area. You would think this would be great. Problem here, according to these folks, is that there were 12 black families that lived in that neighborhood. But the reason why I always point this one out is the remarks. Unless one knows about the colored families living in the district, there is no means of distinguishing their homes from those of their white neighbors. The homes of the Negroes are in many instances better kept than the adjoining homes of white owners, right? So you have folks who were doing it right? They understood the rules of the area, they understood how the game was played, and yet, if they wanted to refinance their home, if someone else wanted to come buy another home in that neighborhood, federal government said, sorry, this isn't for you, right? So this system started around, sort of in using these maps around 1932, 33, 34, somewhere in there, and it essentially continued unabated. Clean through at least until 1968. But if you go back and there's all kinds of research into sort of the long-term impact of this, sort of the areas that were red here are still segregated today, right? So this sort of laid the groundwork for much of the racial segregation that we continue to deal with as a country. I'm going to point out one more to you. Let me see if I can get there. I think it was that it? No, Blake. It's not right. Let's see. There's one more I want to talk about here. Just got to remember where the heck it is now. Is that it? No. All right. There's one more district called Elmwood, which was a lovely district in Oakland. There it is, Elmwood Park. So here's the thing about Elmwood Park. In 1959, a white teacher in San Francisco, using an FHA loan, bought a home in Elmwood Park. Perfectly reasonable. But he couldn't move. For whatever reason, he wasn't ready to move. So he instead rented the home to an African-American colleague of his. The chief of police of the city of Berkeley called the FBI and said, I want to understand how it's possible that an African-American is living in this neighborhood. FBI investigated this, didn't find evidence of mortgage fraud, which in this case would have been that the white teacher bought the home with no intention of living there, but with only intention of renting it to an African-American. Then the FBI handed the case off to the attorney for the DOJ attorney, who investigated it, said no, it doesn't appear to be mortgage fraud. Keep in mind, all the man did was buy a house he couldn't live in and rent it to an African American. Did nothing wrong. Right? So the FHA sent the white teacher a letter saying, you will never again be able to get an FHA loan. We are disqualifying you from all future FHA loans. And if you have a business of which you own 10% or more in, that business will also not be able to get an FHA loan. This was in, again, 1958, 59. Right? So they were very serious about enforcing the color lines that they had created, and they were not playing. One of the other impacts, I'm going to go back to this now, of this map, let's see if I can pull it back up. There we go. Is that we also did all kinds of other things with this. So we would zone the areas around the red and yellow areas for light industrial, meaning that the air, the water would be and the ground would be much more polluted. We would not put transit that connected the red areas to the blue areas and the green areas, right? We built, when we passed bonds in the 1950s and 60s in Oakland, we had mass overcrowding of the schools here. We didn't do anything about it. We actually opened more schools up here, right? And let those schools be small. My kid goes to one of those schools. In fact, my kid goes to one of those schools now, and they're about to consolidate it with the school that is in Burkhalter Park. And at the first meeting, when the district said they're going to do this, a parent stood up and said, but my child won't be safe there. The homes in Burkhalter Park currently go for no less than $1.2 million. Your baby will be fine in Burkhalter Park, I assure you. Right? But that was the first response, right? The home in Elmwood that teacher bought, but the black teacher couldn't buy, is now worth about $2.5 million. So one of the largest impacts of this is a substantial disruption of generational wealth transfer. My grandmother couldn't buy a house in San Francisco. In theory, she could. In reality, not so much. My wife's family, who's from Berkeley, she's from West Berkeley. In Berkeley, you could not buy a house basically above Grove Street. And this is essentially Grove Street right there. So her family of teachers, all of her uncles went to Berkeley. You could not buy a house there. What would happen if you tried? Well, when you grow up and live in a place, you just know the rules, right? So there were all kinds of rules, right? There were restrictive covenants, like this one that said until January 1st, 1989. I have no idea why that date. I really don't. No lot in said tract at any time shall be lived upon by a person whose blood is not entirely that of the Caucasian race. And for the purpose of this paragraph, no Japanese, Chinese, Mexican, Hindu, or any person of the Ethiopian, Indian, or Mongolian races shall be deemed to be Caucasian. But if persons not of the Caucasian race be kept thereon by a Caucasian occupant, strictly in the capacity of servants or employees of such occupant, such circumstances shall not constitute a violation of this condition. Right? Wait, so let me get this straight. I couldn't live in the house unless what? Wait, seriously? Seriously? And the courts had, the Supreme Court had said that these restrictive covenants were not enforceable, but state courts often enforced them anyway. And more importantly, if you knew the neighborhood you were going into had this kind of stance towards you being there, and you went in there anyway. And the second thing is you might get some racist violence. This is from Los Angeles, 1952. And South Dunsmuir Street. It says, Negroes move off Dunsmuir north of, I can't see I never can read the other part, north of Adams, we will bomb all Negroes off. This is Los Angeles, California, right? We think of this might be somewhere in the deep south, right? The reality is this was national policy. This is how it was for people and communities of color all over the country. So, we had to do something. So this is William Rumford. Dr. William Rumford was the first African American elected from Northern California to represent Northern California State Assembly, and he was a civil rights pioneer. I mean, the dude is an impressive man. And so he got passed into law the Rumford Fair Housing Act, which said enough. People can buy houses where they want to live. Enough. And but of course, as you can imagine, some folks said not so fast, my friend. And so this is a protest from Los Angeles against the Rumford Act and in favor of Prop 14. Prop 14 was a state initiative that was literally filed the day after the Rumford Act was passed into law to say, nope, we can go ahead and keep discriminating. Pat Brown, who was then governor, was aghast and was like, we absolutely not. What's wrong? Protests up and down the state saying we're not going to support this segregation amendment. This is wrong. We are California. We can be better than this. Well, it passed with 62% of the vote. It actually wasn't even that close. It passed in Oakland, passed in San Francisco, passed in Los Angeles, passed in Contra Costa County, passed up and down the state. Luckily, the state Supreme Court said, okay, no, wait, really? Did we really just do this again? And so they said this clearly violates the Equal Protection Clause. We can't do this. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, which actually became a very important ruling that says a state cannot pass laws that intentionally support individual discrimination in its state, because you can't do that without getting entangled in violating the equal protection rights of everyone else. So it was struck down and housing discrimination became illegal in theory, but we also know that there are all kinds of ways in which folks are discriminated against, right? Rents would be changed suddenly. They would go up much higher when the applicant was African American versus when they were white. We continue to have substantial issues with both quality of housing, random noise complaints, you name it, right? If folks didn't want you in their property, if people didn't want to sell to you, they would make up new ways to deny you that and then say, look, if you don't like it, sue me, knowing that the cost and the process of doing that was just too much. So in lots of cases, people were able to simply keep black folks out of places, out of other communities, by simply just saying, no, we don't want you here. Now, when this law passed, it also did two things. It both ensured that Pat Brown would be defeated. He was defeated in his re-election campaign for governor, period. It also was a major contributor to the Watts riots, because black folks in Los Angeles were like, we were tired of living in essentially forced slum conditions. And third, it launched a political career of one Ronald Wilson Reagan, who said, if an individual wishes to discriminate against Negroes or others in selling or renting his home, he has the right to do so. Fair housing laws attempt to give one segment of the population a right at the expense of the basic rights of all our citizens. So I just want to pause there for a second, right? This is actually a recurring theme when we talk about how you interrupt racist policy, right? How you interrupt structural racism. It becomes a question of fairness, my fairness to treat you in a way that is cruel and ridiculous, because I can. And there's something both incredibly malicious and incredibly vicious about what he said, and knowing good and well. Ronald Reagan was not a stupid man. He knew enough of the history. He knew enough about his state. He knew enough about these communities to know exactly and precisely who he was talking to and who he was signaling and what exactly he was signaling. And I would submit, and again, I don't presume to know everyone's politics in this room, but our current president does this too, right? When he says, "Your rat-infested slums," knowing perfectly well that that neighborhood, so one of the things that FHA would often do is, once a zone or locality, had identified an area as this is a distressed area because there are black people living here, they would then zone it also for, aside from industry, they would zone it for liquor stores, for adult entertainment spots, for all kinds of other things that would suddenly bring different types of traffic into that neighborhood that may have been a residential neighborhood up until that point. You also would see that public housing in this country for a very long time was actually exclusively for white folks, right? The homes there was a series of homes built in Richmond to support what was then a massive Ford assembly plant. Massive. It's still there. You can go see it's actually it's now the Rosie the Riveter National Museum. It's a fabulous museum. But the housing around there was exclusively for the white workers in that plant. And so, but over time, in places like that, what they began to do is, there was an example I used yesterday, if, let's say you needed $7,000 a month to keep the units habitable, right? And you could say, some of these folks are low income, we're gonna subsidize their housing, everybody else is gonna pay the full $700 a month, and we're good. Over time, what began to happen is the federal government began to actually put more subsidized folks in there. So instead of everyone paying $700 a month, everyone pays $500 a month. And then when the property owner said, "Hey, we need the rest of the money so we can rehab the roof or keep the park nice or paint the place or do lead abatement," they said, "No, you should figure out how to do that on $500 a month per unit versus the $700 we know you need." And so you saw that consistently in Chicago, in St. Louis, in Detroit, in all the places where sort of the reputation and the image of public housing is sort of big cinder block places that are dangerous. That was actually a reputation that over time was created and manufactured, not because the people who lived there were somehow deficient, but because the systems, the policies of the context in which they lived was designed to actually degrade their housing. And so when Trump says Baltimore is a rat-infested slum, ignoring the fact that the map for Baltimore looks just like the map for Oakland, and that through decades of policy, both federal, state, and local, you actually create those conditions, right? But that becomes attached to the people, right? In a very dangerous way. All right, so let's talk about what some of these things have looked like. This is school performance in Oakland. It's my area of specialty. You don't have to bother about these things down here. Just remember that there was sort of a weird shape pattern in the redlining map. That same pattern is here. You can bet every single time. The schools that were doing well in Oakland are up in the blue and green zones up here. The schools that have been struggling are down here. In fact, in 1999, the overcrowding was so bad in Oakland, we were actually double shifting students. That is to say, we had classes year round. We had students that started at different times. In some classes, we had 2 students for every chair because we never bothered to expand the facility size. We had 1,200 students in a building designed for 800 students. That's not going to work, right? And then here's the school performance. So you can't read that. Don't worry about it. But what you should know in Oakland is that roughly 90% of black boys are not proficient in middle school math. 90%, 9-0, in the richest region, in the richest state, in the richest country the world has ever known. 90%. 80% aren't proficient in reading by middle grade, right? Homelessness in Oakland. Over the last 2 years, there's been a 47% increase in homelessness in Oakland. You say, what? Again, richest region, richest state, richest country. How is this possible? And where I live in West Oakland, we were routinely driving by homeless encampments. routinely. So let's talk about housing costs in Oakland. I decided to run a comparison between Oakland and Portland, Maine. I figured that would be fun. So the median cost for a home in Oakland is somewhere around $733,000. Median cost for a home in Portland, Maine is somewhere around that 388,000. I could literally buy twice as many houses here than I could in Oakland, right? A couple reasons for this sort of wild divergence between these two things. One, in California, it's not this lecture, it's a different lecture, we passed a series of laws designed to protect property taxes, that is to keep them low. And the trade-off of that is that I have no incentive to move out of my house. So we paid, in California, it's the only place I know where you routinely talk about how much you paid for your house as just a casual conversation. Like, how's the weather? How much you paid for your house? Oh, this much. Oh, great. So we bought a duplex. We bought it with another African-American couple. We live in West Oakland. We paid $515,000 for that house. So that means each of us paid half. So that's a much more reasonable number to work with, right? And our house is 3 bedrooms, 1 1/4 bath, off-street parking, front yard, side yard, backyard, blah, blah, blah. Great. Close to transit. Great. It's a good house. But if I sold that house, so my property taxes don't actually increase. When I checked Zillow a few weeks ago, I was shocked to learn that my house is now worth over $1 million. And I said, I didn't put a shingle, I ain't put a coat of paint, I ain't broke through a wall, I ain't done nothing to make that house worth $1 million. But here's the deal, I'm not selling the house, right? Because my property tax is essentially on somewhere around $515,000 plus or minus 1 or 2%. And it's not really ever going to increase very much beyond that. In every other state in the union, my property taxes would have been moving up, right? Substantially by now. It would have had some serious conversations with the appraiser saying, how you get $1 million? I didn't put a shingle, a roof, a wall, nothing. So Prop 13 keeps the property taxes low, but in doing so, it removes all incentive for people like me to get out and move to different homes so that someone else can get into the housing market. So that's my example. Multiply that times an entire city, an entire state. And suddenly we have a very tight housing market, constantly. That is, if either you get in or you are not getting in. There is no in between. There's no I'm saving to buy a house in the Bay Area. Unless you are really saving an astronomical amount of money. Because last time I checked, $733,000 is a lot of money to save for a house. And so many folks that buy homes, right? Again, structural, right? Many folks that buy homes, how'd they get that money? Oh, well, see, my grandmother passed, and she had this great house in Elmwood. We didn't want to live in Elmwood because it's not really close to anything for us, so we sold that house for $2.7 million, bought another house for $733,000, just a little closer to Bart, and we kept the change. Well, my grandmother would have wanted to buy a house in Elmwood, so we could do that, but okay, right? So that's how that works. Let's talk about renting. Renting's always my favorite thing. So the median rent, I gotta look here so the median rent in Oakland is $3,100 a month, and the median rent in the United States is $1,500 a month. And the median rent in Portland, Maine is $1,800 a month. So again, I could just about rent 2 places here for what I would rent for 1 place in Oakland. And my mortgage is $1,700 a month. So I'm winning, I'm beating, yes. But again, if you're not in the market in Oakland and your only option is to rent, you're not going to get in the market in Oakland. It's all the housing market, it's buying a home. That's almost going to be impossible. So, having worked in homeless services, I can tell you, what I tell folks is Hamilton Families, we've served 800 families a year. We run 2 shelters. We run a short-term emergency shelter where you can stay for up to 6 months, and we run a longer-term facility for folks who have really deep chronic issues where you can stay for up to 18 months. But our core business is actually getting you in and getting you in housing, subsidizing your housing, giving you the support services you need, so that way at the end of a year or 2 years, depending upon the case, you're able to maintain your housing and move forward. Right? Our goal is that your experience of homelessness is short and non-recurring. That's what we like. The reality is, for most of the families we work with, paying this much in rent is a no-go, right? Half the families that come into our shelter were working when they entered our shelter. Working. They just aren't making enough money. It's impossible, quite frankly. We don't have enough jobs for folks who need that. Now, one of the interesting things I'm gonna do this real fast. We go back to this map here. So further down this way is Hayward, Fremont, other cities. Further up here is Richmond. And so in those areas, and further out here is like Contra Costa County, so Moraga, where St. Mary's is, Pittsburgh Bay Point, and somewhere kind of like this way is like Sacramento, right? And so there are jobs in those communities, right? In a more rational structure, we would have transit infrastructure that would say, hey, if you want to live in Modesto and work in San Francisco, or live in Modesto and work in Oakland, you should be able to do that. You should be able to hop on a train, get up there quick, get your work done, and get home. And it shouldn't take you all day to travel, right? But again, these maps dictated how we did that. These maps have influenced how we design our local transit system. So if you live in Modesto and you have to work in San Francisco, it's a 2-hour trip, one way. And that's if traffic is good. Let traffic be bad. Let there be an accident, right? Let the small bridge we have that goes back and forth be too crowded. It could be 3 hours, 3.5-hour trip just to get to work, right? Our rail system is not well designed. It doesn't go all the way out, right? And it drops you off at sort of weird places along the way. The BART system doesn't get you up here, right? It sort of dumps you and basically it basically dumps you like here, like downtown, here, up here, and then out. And a couple of spots down here. But that's it, right? So one of the issues of the Bay Area is there is so much traffic. It is one of the worst traffic corridors in the country. It is absolutely god-awful. And it's that way because we designed it this way on purpose. That was not an accident. Which means if you were poor and you live somewhere here, some of our families were spending up to $14 a day to get on the public transit to get to work a job that pays you $15 an hour. Your first hour and a half of work is just paying your BART fare. That doesn't make any sense. And again, that's not an accident, right? All right, let me skip. So homelessness, housing costs, and so these are the encampments. Again, remember that exact same shape. There it is again, right? One of the issues that has recently happened is some folks might have heard this is a group called Moms for Housing. So Moms for Housing took over a house on Magnolia Street, about 6 blocks from my house. And they are three moms with children who were experiencing homelessness. And they did it, and they did everything they're supposed to do. I know the homeless response system pretty well. They did everything they're supposed to do, right? They went to the shelters, they did the job coaching thing, they did all that. The truth is they just don't make enough money to afford $3,200 a month. And ironically, one of the challenges with the homeless response system, again, structural, is actually we often don't fund people in terms of subsidizing their rent. We don't subsidize their rent if they have roommates, right? Roommates. So in theory, these 3 women, if they came through Hamilton and we were able to do it, we would have subsidized them each $1,500 a month for their rent. And suddenly, now they have some money. They can get a place. They can get their family stable. They can get their kids in school. They can get moving. But that's not the way the law is written. Section 8 vouchers, which is a federal program where the federal government gives you money, gives you, I think in Oakland, it's up to $3,000 to basically pay, like we'll pay the first $3,000 of your rent for you to be able to live there. Awesome program, proven to be very effective in helping move people out of poverty. There is a 10-year wait for Section 8 vouchers in San Francisco and Oakland. 10 years. If you get on now, you won't get on until your kids are getting ready to get into middle school. Right? Again, it's not like for a state with a $2 trillion economy, we don't have enough money in this country. So homeless encampments, 47% increase in homelessness. And so one of the issues that Moms for Housing pointed out is that there are private companies that bought up tons of homes during the mortgage crisis. Mortgage crisis impacted African Americans by far the worst in the country. Part of it is because you had predatory lending practices occurring. So that's to say something like, I think it was a 2006 study that said something like 60% of the African Americans that were in subprime mortgages could have gotten normal, conventional, stable, safe mortgage products. But they didn't do that, right? Banks were giving kickbacks to their employees, right? Get these folks in these crappy mortgages. They called them ghetto loans, right? The federal government did all kinds of investigation reporting on this. But the impact is that lots of elderly African Americans, lots of young families, lots of single African Americans lost their homes. And they gave them to the bank, and the bank bundled those homes up and sold them to hedge funds. Sold them to groups like Wedgwood, who in this particular case owned the house that the Moms for Housing lived in. They said, we want Edgewood to sell us, to give us house for free. That wasn't going to happen. We want Edgewood to sell this house to what's called a community land trust. So that way the community land trust will own the land, and then they will lease the house back to us for a far more reasonable rent. Right? We don't want to do that. Okay? So they then decided they were going to take them to court to evict them. They took them to court to evict them, got the eviction because that was inevitable. And then a few Tuesdays ago, 2 in.the morning, they roll in with county sheriffs, because in our country, county sheriffs are typically the ones that do the evictions. They roll to the house with county sheriffs, dressed in military fatigues, carrying AR-15s, were driving a tank. For 3 moms living in a house, right? And then last week, Wedgwood said, "You're right. We're just going to sell this to community land trust." And I said, "Well, I don't. Maybe Wedgwood should hire me. Look, y'all can pay me a lot of money. I could tell you should have just did that at the beginning, and just made this easy for everyone." And so while it's great for the Moms for Housing that they got the housing that they so desperately need, and I'm hoping and praying that their children get what they need and they're able to thrive, because what we know is that if you experience homelessness as a child, your odds increase exponentially of experiencing homelessness as an adult, right? But that solution isn't scalable, right? We served 800 families last year at Hamilton Families. They'll serve 800 families again this year, period. And so that's homelessness in Oakland. So let's talk about how these things all work out. So we know that a family compared to a white resident in the Oakland Hills, and again, the Oakland Hills and East Oakland are all of 10 miles apart. I mean, we're not talking hundreds of miles here. You're over 2.5 times more likely to have a low birth weight baby. You have a great nursing school here. I'm positive that the folks in that program can explain to you causes of low birth weight, of what it means to have a low birth weight baby and the impacts that has on that child. But trust, it's quite severe. 10 times less likely to have a mother with a college degree. Again, maternal education is a substantial predictor of how you're going to do in school and sort of longer term success. They are 32 times more likely to live in poverty. 32 times. Again, I can stand in the Oakland Hills and shoot one of those cannon ball things that they have at the stadium. I could probably shoot the ball and hit East Oakland if the wind hits just right. And 3 times less likely to reach that grade level. We just talked about that. As an adult, they're 5 times more likely to be unemployed and 1.3 times more likely to die of stroke. Compared to a white child born in the Oakland Hills, an African American child born in West Oakland can expect to live at least 10 years less. Right? So these are the real impacts of structural racism. It's not just an idea or a concept. This is actually people's lives. These are my kids' friends, right? Our family friends. And this is national policy. So the map I showed you earlier, this is Oakland. This is the map I showed you for Oakland. Every dot has a redlining map. Every single one. I did look for one for Maine, and Chris pointed out in 1932, there probably weren't a ton of people in Maine enough to qualify for however they use the determination. So that's probably why. But I suspect it's probably residential segregation in Maine that's just not reflected in these maps, right? So this wasn't just about Oakland or a few cities here, right? I've got Utah, I've got Washington, Oregon, Chicago, Nebraska, Sioux City, right? Duluth, right? We've got places all over the map. We've got little tiny dots, little tiny places where they said, you know, we're going to go ahead and enforce segregation here. The FHA puts segregation in places where there had previously been no history of segregation. That's how committed they were to this policy as a matter of as a significant federal effort. And if you read some of the documents, one of the things that always strikes me whenever I sort of talk about these things is the amount of cognitive effort that was expended in maintaining this system. It is, I'm exhausted. I'm absolutely exhausted. Like, how did y'all think of everything like this? Every single thing. All right, so last couple points. So this chart here is one of my favorite charts. It requires a little more explanation than I normally do, but I'm going to do it because I think you'll get it. So this is sort of a long-term sort of cohort study, and it compares two. So everyone born, a cohort of folks born between 1955 and 1970, and a second cohort born between 1985 and 2000, right? And so what it focuses on is average neighborhood poverty during childhood among black and white children born 1955 to 1970 and 1985 to 2000. And what's important to get here, two things. One, that the number of black children in America in the first cohort, that's the 1955 to 1970, who were living in neighborhoods that are 30% or more poor. That is extremely high poverty. 30% more, that is extremely high poverty. Is about 1 in 3, right? And that percentage for white children is 1%. In the second cohort, right, we think we have made so much progress, right? So much progress. That number actually just got a little worse for the second cohort. It got a little worse for the second cohort. The systems of structural racism and systematic oppression are brutally effective. Every system is exquisitely designed to get the results it produces. This is an exquisite design. It is. It was designed with care, with intent, with focus, and it's actually working quite effectively, right? So, where do we go from here? Because I know sometimes I'm the bearer of news, bad or otherwise. So there are a couple different places. So this is my favorite quote from Dr. King. I think Chris put it in the email blast here. Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands in the way of love. What I appreciate about that quote is it kind of says, get out of the sentimental, it's going to be all right, let's just hug, we good. Like, no, actually, we got some work to do. And let's quit playing that if we're going to try to make this world more just, that we just do so by sort of holding hands and sort of saying we care for each other. That is necessary but far from sufficient if we're going to interrupt systems this brutally effective and this intricately well designed. So let's go back to the original definition. What is structural racism? A system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. Breaking that is hard because I've got to change public policies, practices, cultural representations, and other norms. And the key for me is that these things are reinforcing. So if I just change one, there's probably things in the other one that will, left to their own devices, cause this to return again, or at least ensure that we get a very similar result, right? That's why we've not done much on neighborhood poverty for black children and white children, or for black children born in two entirely different eras. So, a couple of thoughts. One, it's justice over just me. That is to say, this is not about your individual racism or lack thereof, right? I can feel really great. I can say I treat all people equally. That's great. And you're part of a broader system that is not doing so much to treat people all people equally, right? What are you doing about that, right? I'm reminded of in when I go to Mass, and sometimes we have to do one of the penitential rites, and there's that part where it says, forgive me for what I've done and what I failed to do, right? And that always strikes me. I think, oh, what are all the things where I could have done something better but failed to do it, and why? And how do I need to get right with that choice? And in this domain, there are all kinds of things we fail to do pretty consistently. You know what yours are, right? You know what yours are. I know for me, there are plenty of times when I drive past encampments and I think, man, why are those people here? I wish they'd just go away. Why isn't my neighborhood the way I want my neighborhood to be? Actually, hang on, right? We had, a while back, we had an incident where there was a shooting in front of my house. This was 7 or 8 years ago. Our neighborhood's changed quite a bit now. But there was a shooting in front of our house, and I run outside, and because I heard the shots, so my house is in the back, the kids are playing out front. We had a fence there, but I heard the shots, and if you ever hear gunshots, you really quickly know exactly how far away from you they are. So I run up front, and I'm trying to be calm, right, because I don't want to freak my kids out in case they weren't paying any attention, but I'm also pretty scared. So I run up front, and I'm like, hey guys, what you doing? And so they're like, oh, we're just playing. I'm like, why don't you come inside? Let's watch some movies. Like now, go. I got ice cream and everything. Go. So I get them in the back. And I go and I try to figure out what's happened. And someone did get shot. And so we called all the neighbors together. And I said, well, what do we want to do about this? They said, we should call the police. We should have more police patrols. I said, here's the deal. I'm not so much feeling that our response to violence in our neighborhood is by bringing the police in. I don't think that's going to get us what we want, and I don't think that's going to be right for anybody. So here's what I'm going to do. Since I have some power as then ED of the Oakland Ed Fund, I'm going to call the city council person and have them come to our house, and she's going to meet with us, and we're going to come up with some solutions together. They're like, you can do it? I'm like, director of the Oakland Ed Fund, of course I can. Called her. She came out a couple weeks later. We had a great conversation. I said, I don't want to call the police. Give me some other options. So the option that we came up with was actually partnering with an organization to hire some of the guys that were on the corner to say, look, can you actually help keep the violence down from this neighborhood? We got kids, we want the neighborhood to be safe, but brothers, we also want you to be safe. And whatever it is that's got you on the street, we're happy to lean in with you and help you resolve it, but what we really want you to do is be safe first. And if you're safe, then we're safe. It worked. We didn't have to call the police, right? It began to get calmer in our corner, right? We met all kinds of new people. Some of those folks we actually helped get jobs, get other opportunities, to give them other ways to make income so that they could feed themselves and their families, right? We tried to be more just in that moment than the default setting, which would have been 911, get the police out here, throw people in jail, and do all that foolishness. So that's my point. Justice over just me. Second, understand how race impacts the world, right? You need to be curious. Now, I don't think I need to say that race is not actually a biologically real thing. It's a social construct. So I'm not going to bother to go into that spiel. I'm going to assume that you all know that because you come here today. If you want some resources, I'm happy to give you some around that. But race as a social construct actually has a very powerful ordering effect on lots of parts of our worlds. And you got to be curious about that, right? Reading books, coming to things like this, talking to other folks. This is a wonderful college university. I am positive there are people here who both research this as a part of their profession, or folks who simply have deep curiosity and knowledge, and they're happy to share that. But you've got to do your learning. At the end of the day, I can only teach you so much. You've actually got to say, I want to learn how to do this, and let me go get at it. It's a little like gravity, right? I can't pretend gravity doesn't exist. I can try, but if I walk off that stage, gravity's going to have a word with me pretty crisply, right? And then third, to me, this is Martha and Chris and his wife Martha have been talking a lot about policy and politics. I'm a policy guy. Like that's my jam. I love it, right? And so this is about making anti-racist public policy, right? We are not going to interrupt this by hopes and wishes. We are not going to interrupt this by dreaming and hoping one day in really big speeches. We're going to interrupt this by people making policy that makes a difference in people's lives. And I have a friend of mine's, Herschel, whose mom is a union organizer for the San Francisco Teachers Union. And what Herschel told me is one of the most important truisms I've ever heard, which he said, people are often most concerned with the politics that affect them the least. We spend a lot of time in our country worrying about federal policy. And to be clear, there's many things to be worried about in federal policy. And a ton of the policies that actually impact people's lives can be mediated state by states and localities, right? The Rumford Fair Housing Act could have been passed 10 years before it was passed. It could have been, right? The state Supreme Court was perfectly happy to say, we are no longer going to authorize discrimination in housing in California. They're perfectly happy to do that before, right? You could have mediated many of those things by doing and fighting other policies locally first. Doesn't mean federal policy isn't worth the fight. It's always worth the fight in my book because it matters immensely, as we just talked about. But sometimes the best policies you need are here. So I'll give you an example. A program I used to supervise called Peer Resources. San Francisco has incredibly inequitable transportation, right? It's slow in weird places, and some of it has to do with its own redlining map as they design their transportation system. And so there's a school the best school in San Francisco is way out on the other side of the city. Lowell feels like it's in the middle of nowhere. Right? It's way out, all the way on the west side of the city. And to get there, it's a long bus ride, which means kids got to get up super early. They're getting home super late. They're not able to do their homework. And suddenly at a school as competitive as Lowell, they find themselves falling behind and they're not doing anything wrong, right? So the program I supervise called Peer Resources, they just have been fighting with the city. These are a bunch of young people, mostly young people of color, who said, we need this bus to be a rapid bus. So it gets us from here to here much faster by making slightly fewer stops. But we want to make sure that we're being intentional about the stops that we design so that we're not accidentally disadvantaging other kids in other neighborhoods, right? The city was like, that actually makes a lot of sense. We think we're down for that. That's not a federal policy. It is a transit policy for the local bus system. But if that policy gets passed, which I think everyone kind of thinks it will, then it will mean that kids that go to that school from one side of the city, let's say some red or yellow blocks on the old redlining maps, will be able to get to a school that will give them a materially better educational experience faster. Because young people said, this is a problem and we want to solve it. All right, so last quote I love, Isaiah 58:6. Is this not the fast which I choose, to loosen the bonds of wickedness, to undo the bands of the yoke, and to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? What I love about this one is, to me, I read this, I feel this is about how committed are we to doing this? How serious are we about this? At some level, many of these issues, the first place we have to stop is, how committed are we? Are we willing to put the chips in the middle of the table and fight this? Or I think the example I used this morning is, when conversations get hard, it's like, yeah, but it's snowing outside, and it's cold, and I don't want to do hard work when it's cold. I just want to get a nice Snuggie and a good book and a nice cup of tea, and just sit down and read or do something. And then it's okay, well, wait till the snow passes, and then suddenly it's spring. And it's beautiful, and the sun is shining, and it's warm, and coops up in this hot Snuggie all winter. And take my Snuggie off and go for a walk and listen to the birds tort and swing and all that stuff. Cool. And then it's summer. Can't do work in the summer. Did you see the lake down here? Oh my God, there's concerts. I got to go to the barn and all this stuff. Oh yes, right? And then it's fall. It's fall, and you're in the Northeast. Hello. Can't do work in the fall in the Northeast. It's fall. You've seen the trees. It's so beautiful. All the colors. And it's winter again. It's like, well, I still can't, right? How committed are we to doing this, right? We can do this. I am convinced as a nation, we have put people on the moon. We can do. This should not be as hard as that, and yet somehow we continue to not make progress, right? So I'm calling the question for us here, but more broadly, how do we shift that expectation about what we think is possible for us to do? Alrighty, I'm done talking. Ooh, I was mostly on schedule. Look at me. That's my email. You can always email me. I told people earlier, I'm a COO. I can never leave the office, so I have a stack of cards. I'll put them here on the table. When we're all done, we can have some discussion now, a little back and forth. But if you want my contact information, I'll put the cards here. If you have to cut early for some reason, I'll put the cards there. Then you can take one and hit me on email or the Twitter thing later. All right, that's it. I'm done. Any questions? I will repeat the question for the purpose of my man up there recording this. Yes, ma'am.
An announcement?
Yes.
is having a workshop. Is affordable housing in Portland and dozens of Maine communities is disappearing. Part of a decades-long story of inequality and marginalization rooted in systemic injustice. Sounds familiar?
Yes, ma'am.
Learn more about the history of housing in America and solutions to homelessness.
If I was going to be here, I might go to that myself. Thank you.
They put on very good workshops.
Outstanding. Pebble Street Resources.
Yeah, resources.
Your map that you showed, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
The map that you showed with the circles around the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I read somewhere years ago that residential and school segregation is more extreme in the north.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I read that somewhere, and it has to do with the history of patterns of housing. But I was wondering, and your map seems to reflect that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, do you have any explanation for that? Like, and I've heard, maybe you've heard this, like New York City has like the most racially segregated schools in the country. So I was just wondering, like, if you can explain like the north, the coast.
The coast? Let's just go back to that map.
US,
So let me make sure I got your question. So your question is, what's up with this? And why does this look like this all spaced out and this is up here like this all clustered, right? Yeah. So part of that's a function of that's just the way people live up here. There's just much less space down here, right? I don't spend a lot of time on the East Coast, but it feels like there's a lot of people crammed into a very small set of spaces compared to, say, large parts of California where you get outside of the city, it's like space, right? School segregation, schools in the South tend to be organized across county lines because oftentimes the cities and locales are just too small to rationalize a whole like superintendent administrative structure. So that's one of the important differences. One of the other important differences is that in the North, Joe Biden kind of got justifiably crushed for his stance in the 70s and early 80s of anti-busing, right? And so we have to remember that at this time, so going back, Brown versus Board of Education, at that time, school segregation in the South could mean that you were bused from your house across town to a school that was all black, or it could mean that you were just going to a school in your neighborhood. But for much of school segregation in the South, busing was actually used as a way to reinforce segregation lines, not actually interrupt them, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. And so busing as a concept, post-Brown versus Board of Education, really as an attempt to support integration, was extremely controversial. In fact, I believe the largest school protest in the history of the country, even to this day, took place in New York in maybe the late 50s, early 60s, where a bunch of moms saying, "I don't want my kids going to school with black kids." This is in New York City. If you read the congressional records of the debates over busing and anti-busing legislation coming out of the House and the Senate, some of the most strident anti-busing folks were folks in the North. They were perfectly happy to sort of rain down the South as racist and segregationists, and several Southern senators were perfectly happy to point out the incredible contradiction. And so there was very little done to sort of interrupt the residential segregation patterns that these maps created when it came to schools. In fact, the realtors very specifically said, we are definitely not trying to put neighborhoods together where black kids and white kids have to go to school together. And so a lot of this system spills into that, and then it just kind of continues to get worse, right? So you can imagine in West Oakland, where African Americans were concentrated because that's the only place you could buy a house. And for a long time in Oakland, that's where most of the black kids went to school. In fact, my kid's school, Kaiser Elementary, which is in the hills, when it opened, it was actually under-enrolled by 50%, which is crazy to open a school that's going to be under-enrolled by 50%. That is a bad idea for any number of reasons. And so what the district did is they said, well, if you want to send your kid up here, let's say you lived in West Oakland, then you'd have to figure out how to get yourself up to Kaiser. There was no public transit to Kaiser, which meant the number of people that could do that automatically reduced, right? But for 1 year, they had a busing program. They got some federal money. They had a little busing program because the district was losing a ton of money having Kaiser open, half enrolled. So they did that program for 1 year. Everyone was like, yes, we feel so good about ourselves. And the money ran out, like, oh, we're canceling the program. And you can read in the school board records black parents coming to the school board crying, saying, please, this is the best my child has ever done in school. Can we please keep this going? They're like, nope, thanks. Right? So there was very little interest in our country in interrupting patterns of residence segregation and school segregation, and this was extremely pronounced in the North and the far West, which is why we see schools the way they are today. Anything, other questions?
Just a curiosity, Oakland Coliseum basketball team, I wonder where that stadium is, and the new stadium is in a different neighborhood.
Oh, yeah. So the mighty Golden State Warriors, best basketball team in a long time on the planet. Thank you, thank you. I'm going to quit making all my sports references here because I feel like I'm in New England and y'all going to get me. So let's see. I think I can do it, just show you. Oh, wait, nope, back. Let's see. So the stadium is, come on, where it is. Oh, wait, no, where to go? The stadium is, so the Oakland Alameda County Coliseum Complex is, let's see, there's the estuary, I think the airport. So it's somewhere like over in here, actually. So the Coliseum is Oracle Arena, which is where the Mighty Warriors played for the last 40-ish years, and where the Oakland Traders played. And the beloved, still loyal to us all, Oakland A's. And the complex is something like 40, 50, 60 years old. And the Raiders have moved to Las Vegas. Bye. The A's want to build a stadium, essentially the Alameda, basically right in here somewhere. No, a little over. Down in here somewhere at Howard Terminal. And then the Warriors bought land in Mission Bay. So in San Francisco, the 89 earthquake, there used to be a freeway that sort of ran along the main promenade there, which is the place, if you see aerial shots of San Francisco coming in over the top, that's what the big like San Francisco ferry building, it used to be the Hillman Brothers coffee sign. You see in old movies and all that, there was a gigantic freeway there called the Embarcadero Freeway that ran all the way there. And it connected the part of the freeway that went to the airport all the way around to the Golden Gate Bridge. It was a major thoroughfare. 89 earthquake comes, that sucker's got to come down. It's collapsed. It's game over. So they had a couple choices. They could rebuild it or replace it with a pedestrian street. And mercifully, for all our sakes, they tore it down, and it just opened up the most beautiful. If you ever get to San Francisco, going to the ferry building is the only point of going to San Francisco. It is spectacular. But that also opened up all of this area that had previously, when I was a kid there, it was no-go zone. There was nothing happy down there. And so the Giants' new stadium, Oracle Park, is there. It's beautiful. It's just ridiculous panoramic view of the Bay Area. Honestly, you pay for the tickets. Who watches the game? You're like, oh my God, look at this. It's so pretty. And then there's a whole sort of commercial district down there. Housing is down there. All of it's wholly unaffordable. And then if you kind of follow the road around, there's Chase Center is down there. And so I had to go to the Chase Center to pick up an opening night to pick up a check from Metallica. Things I told my kids, are like, Metallica, who now, Dad? What is this? So actually, my older kid, real quick, I put on some Metallica music. And his exact words were, Dad, this might be better with a trap beat. I think we should change the music up here. And I was like, TJ Stanley, that is not correct. So anyway, so it's a beautiful facility, gorgeous. There's housing there. It also is next to UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital, which is a marvelous complex. But that's where it is. The Warriors are never coming back to Oakland. They are making more money than is reasonable with the new stadium, and they are perfectly happy there, and it's a beautiful place. What will happen to the Coliseum is an open question. The A's want to buy it and then convert a lot of it to ball fields and other rentable facilities on the parking lot, because the parking lots there are it's acreage. It was designed where you could have two major sporting events simultaneously. So there are tons of parking. It's got great transit structure. So they want to do some housing, probably wholly unaffordable, and park and ball fields and other things to sort of engage the community. The city's being a little difficult, but I think they'll end up selling because that money's good money. We need it for other things. Oracle Arena, I think, probably will still be active as a concert, entertainment, conference venue for a while. It's like, 10 minutes from the airport. So that's a pretty good deal in the city where those things are pretty hard to find. And there's lots of good jobs there, right? So those are excellent jobs for folks. And this area down there is still pretty red. Still lots of economically displaced folks, lots of folks who are really struggling economically. So if we can keep them in that neighborhood, keep them working in the neighborhood, give them good, solid living wage jobs, which now minimum wage is 16 something an hour in Oakland. It kind of creeps up a little every couple of years. That's actually good. That might come out as a good win for folks. We hope.
What about with Amazon? Does Amazon have a lot of, how are they impacting the area? Don't they have a lot of?
They have some distribution centers, I'm pretty sure. There's a whole part that's like down here. There's a bunch of warehouses, and sort of as you get kind of this part of Oakland, you can get much more heavy industrial. So they can have warehouses and stuff in there, but I think the way sort of tech generally impacts Oakland is in a couple ways. One, San Francisco is unaffordable to people that work at companies like Salesforce, right? Where the starting salary might be $100,000, $120,000, which again, in every other part of the country except for a few, is an astronomical amount of money. And if someone said your starting job is $120,000, you're going to go home and turn some cartwheels. You can call your family and friends and be like, I made it, mama. But here it's like, I think currently in San Francisco, $110,000, I think it's a family of 4 or 5 is considered low income. Yeah, it's like, says what? So we're actually seeing quite a bit of push into the housing market in Oakland from folks who just can't afford to find a place to live in San Francisco, even though they make an astronomical salary. So what that has the effect of is end up pushing up the rents, because again, if in any given community there are only 10 people that are going to pay $5,000 a month for rent, then if you're a landlord and you don't get one of those 10, then I'm going to drop the rent because me having an empty apartment is costing me money. However, if I have an influx of people, I suddenly have 100 people that can pay $5,000 a month for it. Well, if I'm a landlord, then I might jack that rent up to $5,000 and take my chances, which means that for the mom who can only pay $1,800 a month for rent, that's a bad deal, right? There's no way she's going to get from $1,800 to $5,000. So that's typically how we see it. There's always talk in Oakland, as there is, I'm sure, in every other community, about gentrification and sort of what's lost as these communities turn over. Because again, the folks that rent homes for $5,000 a month, they're going to bring other things into that community that might displace the folks and the culture and the environment and the feel that was there before. And so we've seen that in all over Oakland, where communities just, you walk in and you feel different. I mean, I grew up in San Francisco, and it feels different. When I go over there for work, I'm like, this neighborhood, I took my kids on the tour once of the neighborhoods, and I was like, yeah, this isn't really how it was when I was a kid. And there's something that's lost about that I think folks are really struggling to figure out. How do you hold on to that? How do you realize some of it you have to let go, and what's worth defending? And it's kind of unresolved. Excellent question. Other questions, friends? Nothing else?
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.